Hello, this is Gamer Vince, and this is my tutorial on, or a base tutorial on optimizing a fighter in Pathfinder. So this is going to be a video series I'm going to do to sort of talk a little bit about if you're wanting to play certain classes in Pathfinder and how not to suck at them. I highly recommend also looking at a more detailed uh, um, guide online, like a written guide. But if you're like me, I enjoy sort of visual learning and talking about it. So this is trying to fill that need. Okay, but let's talk about fighters. So if you go to the D20 PFSRD website and you click on fighter, you're going to get the information I'm about to look at right here. So fighters. So you want to play a fighter. The first thing you got to understand when playing any class is what is the role of the class. What is the point? What is it that you're trying to do? Um, like a rogue, for instance, is usually your damage. Is dealing quite a bit of damage, or disarms traps and is the skill monkey. Um, but we're talking about fighters here. What do fighters do? Well, unsurprisingly, they fight. You want to excel at combat, but there's still a couple of options you have. Do you want to be the primary damage source? Do you want to be very, very tanky? Do you want to, be hard to hit? Do you want to actually more specialize in disabling your opponent? Or do you want to deal just lots and lots of damage? So that's the first thing you want to think about, is how you want to play your fighter. A couple of things that fighters can't do very well is do skills. The fighter skill list is very poor, and they don't get very many skills. So that is not something you want to do as a fighter. Play a rogue or a bard if you want to have lots of skills, and a variety of skills. And the other thing that fighters are not going to be terribly good at is anything that's outside of combat, really, which is mostly skills, but like your wizard is going to be able to cast all kinds of utility spells that a fighter just can't match. So fighters live in combat. And that's a big part of D&D, so I don't mind that at all. But let's talk build. Let's first talk about, what makes a fighter good at combat. First of all, they get full base attack bonus. What that means is that every level their base attack bonus is going to go up by 1. If you keep taking levels of fighter, your base attack bonus will be equal to your level. Notice that base attack bonus here is 12, and it's, at level 12, it's 12. This, what the 7-2 here means, is just your additional attacks are going to be at -5. So you get 3 attacks, the first of which is at full BAB, then -5 for 7, then -5 again for 2, in case you didn't know what that was. And by the way, I'm going to be specifically talking about Pathfinder here because 3.5 fighters kind of suck compared to their Pathfinder counterparts. 3.5 fighters are, you want to take maybe a level or 2 in fighter and then never pick it up again, because 3.5 fighters get a couple of bonus feats, but then they get, I believe, a bonus feat at first level and second level, and then they don't get anything at third level, which is why I usually don't want to take a third level fighter. You want to go take something else in 3.5. But in Pathfinder, you can totally take any class from first level to 20th, and you'll be just fine. Okay, fighters also get a D10 of hit dice, so they're going to have lots of health. And another big bonus for being a fighter is that they are proficient with everything. They're proficient with all simple and martial weapons, as well as heavy, light, and medium shields and armor and everything, and tower shields. So they're just proficient in all weapons and armor, with the exception of exotic weapons. Those you're still going to need to take feats for, or specialized races. So no exotic weapons, but everything else. Okay, so that's what makes a fighter good. That's sort of the bread and butter of the fighter. And they're also going to get a couple of skills like armor training, which is going to give them a bonus to armor, and weapon training, which is going to give them a bonus to certain types of weapons. Okay. So let's actually talk about weapons, because what your fighter is going to do is going to depend in very, very large part on what weapon you choose to use. And there's actually more options than you might think. Alright, so let's go to the weapons tab here under equipment. So first, you got to make the broad choice. By the way, never use a simple weapon if you can take a martial weapon. Martial weapons are just plain better than simple weapons, so just ignore the entire simple section. Also, for a fighter, you don't really want to take a light melee weapon. That's more for rogues. So I would ignore that. Alright, so first real option is, do you want a one-handed melee weapon, a two-handed melee weapon? Do you want to be an archer? Or do you want to do like, do you want a sword and board, which means one-handed melee weapon plus a shield? Or do you want to dual-wield weapons? And those are all fine choices. One-handed melee weapons, so let's talk about one-handed melee weapons. One-handed melee weapons, you can go either with a shield or another one-handed melee weapon. If you go with another one-handed melee weapon, you're going to be going like the dual weapon fighter route of wielding like a sword and a short sword or something along those lines. And that is going to, that's going to maximize the number of attacks you get. And it doesn't necessarily maximize the damage you deal, but it does give you options for attacking lots of things. So if you get surrounded, you can do lots of stabbing. From an optimization point of view, a two-weapon fighter is not as the most optimized it could be. It's an okay choice. It's not a bad choice, but a rogue will likely do it better. So I don't super recommend two weapon fighting, but if you want to do it, fighters can. They most certainly can, and it is actually a fine choice. Sword and board is another choice you can go, and it is sort of the favorite choice of the tank, which means that you're going to use a melee weapon and then you're going to use a shield to boost your AC. And that's a fine thing to do if you want to be just very, very tanky, if you want to have a very high AC. However, a big problem in both 3.5 and Pathfinder is that there's no such thing as taunting. And whether a sword and board fighter is going to be effective depends in large part on your dungeon master. If your dungeon master is the kind of person who says, hey, the fighter is big and scary looking, the creatures are going to attack him, or if the fighter is allowed to like spew off insults and be like, hey, you know, your mother was a hamster and your father smelled of elderberries, and that's going to make creatures attack him. If that is the case, then a sword and board is actually very effective at protecting the party. However, there is nothing in the rules that says that creatures have to attack the fighter, or you know, anything like that. So sometimes it can be very difficult for the fighter to draw aggro, you know, like to make enemies attack him instead of his friends. So that can be a problem. Whether I recommend being, you know, like the full tank depends on your dungeon master. If your dungeon master is the kind of person who's going to allow you to sort of role play into getting your opponents to attack you, then you know then the sword and board can be very, very effective. But if your dungeon master doesn't do that, then you may be frustrated by enemies ignoring you, because you're not going to deal that much damage, or not as much damage as you could be, and you'll be very hard to hit. So if the creatures ignore you, well then, so much for that. So that's one-handed melee weapons. And by the way, if you're doing a one-handed melee weapon, there is there's a couple of good weapons in here. A good weapon would be like a scimitar. A scimitar is really good because it has the high crit range, 18 to 20. And only deals a d6 of damage, but that's okay. A longsword is sort of the nice middle ground because it deals a d8 of damage if you're medium-sized, and you know, has a lesser crit range, but still a good crit range. And if you want to go for sort of pure damage, you could go for like, say, a Sizor, which, you know, deals a d10 of damage. Which I was just looking over this and I didn't even really notice that. I recommend the scimitar because a higher crit range actually does mean more damage. If you look at the averages of weapons, scimitar is going to be your best bang for your buck in one-handed melee weapons, because critting is good. All right, let's talk about two-handed melee weapons. Two-handed melee weapons are really what, if you want to deal damage, that's the way to go. Two-handed melee weapons are going to deal the most damage out of anything you can pick. So you're not going to have a shield, and you're going to be right in the thick of things. So you're going to be taking more damage. But that said, you're going to be dealing a lot of damage. You're probably at the early levels, and even at some of the later levels, you're going to be dealing the most damage. So this is, if you really want to impress your friends with ridiculous amounts of damage, then that's the way to go, is two-handed melee weapons. And the two-handed melee weapon of choice is, for me, the falchion. For the same reason that I suggested the scimitar, it's the crit range. But there are plenty of other good choices here, like a flail is a d10 of damage, which is not that great for a two-handed weapon, but it's got a decent crit range, and it can be used to disarm and trip opponents, which that's nice. A glaive gives you reach, which means you got longer, reach. You can attack enemies from further away, which is nice. One thing that I think is sort of like a newbie trap is the great axe. The great axe, it sounds really cool to roll a d12 of damage, but right down here is the great sword, which deals 2d6, and 2d6 dice is better than 1d12. On average, 2d6 is going to deal more damage, and it's got a better crit range. I know the times 3 is really tempting. It's just like, oh, I'm going to roll a d12, and I get times 3 damage on a crit. Oh, that's so cool. But basically, you're better off. On average, you're just going to be much better off with the greatsword, because the expanded crit range is actually better. Critting on a 19 or 20 is better than the times, and dealing times 2 is better than the times 3, and the 2d6 is better than the 1d12. So the greatsword, I think, is a good choice, and the falchion, I think, is probably the best choice. It deals less damage, and in fact, it deals quite a bit less damage, but the expanded crit range, it'll come up a lot more often. That said, another reason why I'm recommending this is because fighters have lots of options for expanding crit range. There's a feat, and much more common to take is the weapon enchantment called Keen, which doubles the crit range, which for a greatsword would crit on a 17 or better, but then for a falchion would crit on a 15 or better. That's a 30% crit chance, which is really, really good. So that's like the Keen enchantment is like the best enchantment in the game, sort of, in my opinion. I mean, Vorpal, sure, is cool, but Keen, you're going to get it more reliably, and it's cheaper, and it's all kinds of good. Okay, two-handed fighter with a falchion or a greatsword is going to be really, really good. And two-handed weapons also give you lots of options, like you could do, a guy's arm to get reach and trip, or, if you wanted to build a fighter that way. By the way, to keep an lookout for trip. Tripping, disarming is also pretty nice, but can quite often be made useless against, say, a bear. You can't disarm a bear. It has the right to bear arms. You cannot disarm a bear. It has no weapon in its hands, in its paws. But trip works on tons and tons of things. So trip is a really good one. I do recommend, if you want to go for trip, go for trip. It's really good. The other option you have is, so if you don't want to go for a melee weapon, you can use a ranged weapon. Ranged fighters are pretty dang good, so they're not to be underestimated. Ranged combat is very, very feat dependent. You're going to be using all your feats, but fighters have so many feats that they can really do it effectively. And a ranger is, to be perfectly honest, a fighter can probably make a better ranger quicker than a ranger can. At the end, they'll be about the same. And if you're going to go with a ranged weapon, I recommend getting either a longbow or a composite longbow if you can afford it and kind of keep up with it. What a composite longbow does is, it actually tells you a lot more information than the last time I was here. But a composite longbow allows you to add your strength modifier in damage to the weapon, and as a fighter, you tend to be relatively strong anyway. So you can get like a composite longbow +2 or something like that, which means that you need to have at least a 14 strength to wield it. Otherwise, you can't. You can't draw the bow. It's too heavy. But you get to add up to +2 of your strength modifier to the damage. So if your strength modifier is like +3, then you could get a composite longbow +3 to add +3 to your damage. But be aware of that if you somehow lose strength, like due to a disease or something like that, you will no longer be able to draw your bow. So do be aware of that. Ranged weapons are a pretty good way to deal damage. And it allows you to damage things that are flying and that kind of thing. So ranged weapons are not a bad way to go. So what I'm basically saying here is that for your average game, I probably recommend two-handed melee weapon. That is going to be the best bang for your buck. But a ranged weapon is a pretty decent choice too, especially if the campaign setting sort of calls for lots of ranged combat. And the one-handed melee weapons, if you really need a tank and your DM allows you to roleplay aggro, then that's a good choice too. Okay, so now you've chosen what kind of fighter you're going to be, let's talk about ability scores. So once you know what kind of fighter you are, and you do need to pick what kind of fighter you are before you're generating ability scores, because it's going to depend. Essentially what you want to do is, if you're using a melee weapon, you're going to need a really high strength. Let's see, is there a nice little sheet here or something like that? No, there's tons and tons of information here, but nothing really good to look at while I talk about this. But essentially, what I want you to understand is sort of, if you're a melee-based fighter, you need a high strength, and if you are a ranged weapon fighter, you need a relatively high dexterity. If you're a two-weapon fighter, you also need a high dexterity, because the feats you need require a high dexterity. Essentially what you want to aim for is for, if you're your regular sort of melee weapon fighter, you want usually at least a 16 strength, you want a 12 dexterity. If you can muster a 14 constitution, that would be great, but sort of like a 12 constitution will do you just fine. Then you want to dump your charisma. Charisma, if you can get it down to a 7, do it. You don't need it. Which, you know, is kind of unfortunate, because like intimidation is based off of charisma, so if you want to be the intimidating fighter, it's kind of unfortunate that charisma just isn't used for anything for a fighter. Keep wisdom at about 10, because you don't want to take a penalty to your will save, and your intelligence also about 10. Intelligence helps you get more skill points, and skill points are nice, but you're a fighter, you're going to kind of suck at it no matter what. So a 10 intelligence will fine. The 10 wisdom is primarily just to not take a penalty to your will save. And if you can get to something close to that, that's pretty good. If you are a two-weapon fighter, so the reason why it's kind of problematic to be a two-weapon fighter is that at some point you're going to need a dexterity of 17. You're going to need to get there somehow, and that can be problematic because your damage still comes from strength. So you're going to need a high strength and a high dexterity, and a lot of your dexterity is also going to be wasted because you're going to have access to plate mail, and plate mail only allows up to like 1 dexterity to be added to your armor class. By the way, that's why I recommend 12 dexterity for most fighters, because so you can add +1, so you can wear plate mail and still get +1 to AC and flat-footed and all that stuff. If you went with like a 14, then some of that would get wasted and not be added to your AC. Of course, that's going to depend on how many like attribute points or how your DM is making you assign rolls, or if you're rolling for stats, if you're assigning stats. But essentially what you want to do is get strength as high as possible if you're a melee fighter, two-handed weapon fighter, or any kind of melee fighter. If you're a 2-weapon fighter or a ranged fighter, you need a decent dexterity as well. Also, probably as high as you can get it, a 16 would be good for those guys as well. Otherwise, go for the dexterity of 12. And then get your constitution. Your constitution is going to determine your hit points. 12 is pretty good. If you can get it to 14, that'd be even better. The higher the better on that. Don't take a penalty. God, don't take a penalty on constitution. You need hit points as a fighter. And charisma can be a 7. Charisma is your dump stat. That's one thing to remember. Everything else, wisdom and intelligence, 10. Okay. That's ability scores. Let's pick a race. So so you remember to assign your ability scores before you pick a race, but you may keep your race in mind while determining your ability scores. By the way, in 3.5, a big difference between 3.5 and Pathfinder is that races in 3.5 are a lot worse. In Pathfinder, races are going to have a net benefit to their ability scores. Like a dwarf, for instance, gets +2 constitution, +2 wisdom, and -2 charisma, but if you add and subtract those together, then you're going to end up with a net benefit of +2. That's not the case in 3.5. The net benefit is 0. Like a human won't get anything. But I'm going to be talking about Pathfinder here, because as I've already mentioned, in 3.5, fighters kind of suck anyway. Sorry fighter fans in 3.5. Fighter is sort of something you take a dip in. You take 1 or 2 levels of it, and then take something else. And I'm not going to be talking about that here. I'm going to be talking about Pathfinder. Okay, so good races to take as a fighter. You could be a half-orc or a human. Those are both decent choices. Human is sort of like one of the best choices, primarily because of the free feat. But you also get an extra skill point, which is just nice. Half-orc is not bad either. They're not as good at it as a human, which is kind of ironic because you'd think half-orcs would make excellent fighter. The only bonus really that the half-orcs have over the human is the dark vision. Dark vision is really nice, being able to see in the dark. But that kind of depends on your campaign setting. Are you going to be spending a lot of time underground? Yeah, maybe. Weapon familiarity and orc ferocity are pretty useless, in my opinion. It's just really the dark vision. And they get to speak an additional language, which is always nice. So humans are an excellent choice. Just extra fee is always good. Some of the other things you can take is anything with a strength bonus. Do not, I repeat, do not play a small character. Small characters are going to use smaller weapons. Sure, they get a bonus to AC and they get a bonus to hit, which might seem attractive, but the hit to damage is actually really big. And you're just not going to be as effective. Also, small creatures tend to have a lower speed, and if you're wearing plate mail, that's going to be degraded further. So small creatures just take too many penalties to be worth it for a fighter. I do not recommend taking a small creature, which is why I completely skimmed over halfling and gnome. Not only because they take a penalty to strength, which is really terrible, but there's a couple of other kind of cool races you can take aside from human. Human fighter is the classic thing to do, but if your DM allows for featured races or uncommon races, there are some good choices here. The first thing I'm going to mention is Tiefling. You may think to yourself, well, why Tiefling? And the reason why Tiefling is because, the +2 dexterity and +2 intelligence, -2 charisma is not great. But if you go all the way to the bottom here and find the variant Tiefling heritages, there is basically any kind of Tiefling that you could possibly want to play, including one like a demon spawn that gives you +2 strength, +2 charisma, or +2 strength, +2 wisdom, Oni spawn. That's pretty dang good. So if your DM allows you to pick Tiefling variants, an Oni spawn fighter, really good. Oni spawn Tiefling, yeah. +2 strength, +2 wisdom, -2 to charisma, perfect. Even the +2, the Clip-Off spawn, the Motherless. I mean, they've got cool kind of heritages and roleplay aspects to them, and you can get ways to get strength bonuses down here. So they're actually pretty good. Worth a look. But like I said, ask your DM if that's okay, because I'm pretty sure you're supposed to take a feat to even get these, and then you're supposed to roll randomly, hence the D10. So if you're going to roll randomly, don't do it. It's not worth it, because you might get something that could even get, I believe, a penalty to strength. No, I don't think there's any penalty to strength, but you could get some bad things here. So don't roll for it randomly, but if your DM allows you to pick it, that's good. All right, so we're going to do that. Tiefling, so that's an option. The Aasimar have the same kind of option, so Aasimar and Tiefling. Aasimars tend to be kind of broken to begin with. But yeah, those are options. Other good options would be, for instance, where are you? I was looking for the Hobgoblin. Hobgoblin, you may think to yourself, well, it doesn't get a bonus to strength, but you know, they get a couple of nice little bonuses, like to dexterity and constitution, and they get no penalty. That's pretty dang good. And I believe they get +1 natural armor, which, you know, or you can get that. I believe that is something they can get. Yeah. So there's a couple of good alternate racial traits. So Hobgoblin is something worth checking out. And aside from that, I mean, you can go with an Orc for the +4 strength, but I don't actually recommend it because it isn't really worth it. You get a -2 to charisma, wisdom, and intelligence, which means you're going to be losing skill points, your will save's going to go down, and your charisma, already abysmal charisma, is going to go down even further. You have the light sensitivity penalty, and you basically gave all that up, and they only really get like dark vision, the same kind of benefits you get for being a half orc, you get as an orc. And you gave all that kind of good stuff up just for the +4 strength. It's not really worth it. If you want to be a strength monster, then, you know, Orc is a fine choice, and there's a lot of good sort of roleplay aspects to it. But Orc, I don't actually recommend. I think the penalties are just not worth the extra little bit of strength. Oread, on the other hand, right underneath it, is another excellent choice with the strength and wisdom. Also, you get the benefit of being a native outsider, which, by the way, that's something a lot of people don't really think about, is the type, that the vast majority of these things are humanoid, but a couple of them, like the Tiefling, and like the Aasimar, and like the Oread, are outsiders. Why is this a benefit? It's because a whole slew of spells aren't going to work on you. Well, it can be a detriment at times. Like, for instance, anything that says person in it, any spell that says person does not affect you because you are not a person. I know how that sounds, but that's essentially what it is. Anything that only affects humanoids isn't going to affect you, like enlarge person, which kind of sucks because it's like, I wish that, you know, I could get the benefits of enlarge person. But on the other hand, things like hold person aren't going to affect you either. So I usually consider it a benefit because there's a couple of beneficial spells you're foregoing, but there's a lot of really, really common debilitating spells that are not going to affect you, like hold person, or like charm person and things like that. Anything that says person in it that only affects humanoids isn't going to affect outsiders, so that's kind of a benefit. Also, the Oreads get the benefit of that energy resistance to acid. Acid is not very common. It's energy resistance fire. If you can get it, that's really good. All the other resistances are they're okay. Depends on the setting. Alright, but Oread's another fine choice. And aside from that, you want to avoid a constitution penalty if you can. And obviously you want to avoid a strength penalty. All other penalties you can sort of deal with. And yeah, so I think I've given you enough races to sort of pick from. Aside from that, I mean, you could be like Asuli, with a bonus to strength. Anything with a bonus to strength is pretty good. Of course, if you're playing a 2-weapon fighter or a ranged fighter, you might be looking for a bonus to dex, but still don't take a penalty. Still don't take a penalty to strength, and don't be a small creature. Do not recommend. Okay, that's races. Let's talk about by far the biggest thing that you're going to have to worry about in Pathfinder. If you're playing a fighter, you're going to have an abundance of feats. So let's click on feats here. I like to use the feat tree. If you don't know about the feat tree, God, the feat tree is so good. Essentially, there's a couple of feats you want to be considering. There is weapon focus, and weapon specialization. Focus. Give me weapon focus. So weapon focus, yeah, notice already here is that I just did a control F find weapon focus on the page here, and it comes up 28 times. It's used as a prerequisite for a lot of things. What weapon focus does is you pick a weapon and you get +1 to attack with it, which isn't that great, but fighters also get access to greater weapon focus where they can further increase that to a +2. And that's a fighter-specific feat. So that's actually not that bad. It's not the greatest, but it's not bad. Another thing you want to look at maybe is improved trip. What improved trip is that it requires combat expertise, which is it's something that's combat expertise by itself is not that great, but it's a prerequisite for a lot of things. But improved trip is a really good one because you get a +2 bonus on trip attempts, and you don't provoke attacks of opportunity when trying to trip opponents. Trip is pretty debilitating. You basically make a combat maneuver bonus attack versus their combat maneuver defense, and if you succeed against them, you can trip them. Trip does require that you have a free hand to do. I had one really lenient DM who said that if you're using a two-handed weapon, you can essentially let go of your weapon with one hand to trip them, which I'm not sure if the rules aren't explicit that you can't do that. I mean, essentially, a two-handed weapon can be held in one hand just for the purposes of a trip. That doesn't seem that problematic. If your DM allows something like that, then you can be a tripping monster. Otherwise, get a trip weapon, like a flail or something like that, so you can trip your opponent. Because tripping is yeah, it's pretty debilitating to be tripped in the middle of combat. They're going to either have to provoke attacks of opportunity to get back up, which is also going to take their move actions, so they're not getting away, or they're going to just have to take, or you're going to get a +4 to attack them on the ground. So improved trip is something worth looking at. A couple of other things. One thing that has been improved vastly in Pathfinder is toughness. It used to be in 3.5 that toughness just gave you 3 hit points, which is terrible. Don't ever take toughness in 3.5 unless you need it as a prerequisite for something. Toughness kind of sucks. In Pathfinder, they made it a lot better where you get +1 hit point per level. Essentially is what that means. You get 3 hit points to start with, and then beyond 3rd level, you get 1 hit point per level, which is why it doesn't suck. It's essentially like an extra point of constitution, or an extra modifier of constitution, which is not bad. So toughness is actually can be worth getting if you need the extra hit points. One really good fighter feat is weapon specialization. Whoop, specialization. I think I just saw it there. Yeah, weapon specialization. It requires you to be a 4th level fighter, and so it's a fighter specific thing, but it gives you +2 damage with one weapon, which, you know, and then you can take greater weapon specialization later as well. So, oh man, is that's pretty good. Just the extra damage is always good. It's not actually going to be that much damage compared to what you're already doing, but it's still pretty dang good. If you are a 2-weapon fighter, you are going to need the 2-weapon fighting feats, which here we go. Which are right here. 2-weapon fighting. Notice that the first level of 2-weapon fighting, which is pretty much mandatory, if you're going to be using 2 weapons, you got to get 2-weapon fighting. You got to have a dexterity of 15, but you want to eventually get to like improve 2-weapon fighting, which requires a dex of 17. That's why I was saying you eventually had to get a dex of 17. And this is also relatively feat intensive. If you're a 2-weapon fighter, you're going to need 2-weapon fighting, and eventually you'll want improved 2-weapon fighting to get the additional thing. A couple of other good things is double slice, which you get to add your full strength bonus instead of half strength bonus to your offhand weapon, which that's nice. So double slice is a good one. Improved 2-weapon, where's 2-weapon defense? Yeah, 2-weapon defense is you gain a +1 shield bonus when fighting with 2 weapons, which that's not bad. That's one you should maybe consider getting if you're a 2-weapon fighter. And yeah, all these kinds of things. So 2-weapon fighting is relatively feat intensive. Another thing that is feat intensive is ranged attacks, point blank shot. So if you are a ranged attacker, then you need point blank shot. You need point blank shot and you need precise shot. Those two are mandatory. So normally you take a -4 penalty for shooting into melee combat, like you're trying not to hit your friends. You're trying to hit your mark, and melee combat is kind of chaotic. So you need precise shot to get rid of that, just to get rid of that penalty. Point blank shot is a prerequisite to precise shot. That's kind of why you need it. And then after you have those 2 feats squared away, you want rapid shot and many shot. Rapid shot gives you an additional attack. It's basically like 2-weapon fighting for ranged attack. You don't need to wield 2 weapons. You still only wield 1 bow, but you know, rapid shot's really good. And then many shot is another really good one. And notice you also need a dexterity of 17, but since it's directly related to your attack roll, I feel like it's not as big of a waste. Alright, and then here's a really, really big one, power attack. Since I thought that was nice, that was right down here underneath point blank shot. Power attack is a really big one. Power attack you'll want to get if you're a melee fighter, because it allows you to trade your attack bonus for damage, and it's a really, really nice thing to have. Because the amount of damage you get is, and you get to choose. You get to choose whether you're power attack or don't. So it's an option that it gives you during combat to just deal massive, massive amounts of damage. So power attack, highly recommend if you're a melee fighter, especially if you're a 2-handed melee fighter. The amount of damage you get from this is just insane. All right, cleave. Now, a lot of you are going to be looking at this and are going to thinking to yourself, wow, cleave seems really good. It is unfortunately a little bit of a noob trap. Cleave is really good at levels 1 through 5. Cleave, what it allows you to do is it allows you to make, if you hit an opponent, you get to make a special standard action cleave attack. You basically declare as a standard action, and that's key, as a standard action you make a single melee attack, and if it hits you get to attack somebody next to him and make another attack. So there's 2 reasons why cleave is not that great. One is you probably won't encounter that many opponents that are just kind of going to stand next to each other and allow you to cleave. Actually, they made it better in Pathfinder, where you can just attack somebody else within reach. So it's actually is not that big a deal in Pathfinder. It's a bigger deal in 3.5. However, the reason why cleave begins to suck at later levels is because it's a standard action to use, and it doesn't stack with multiple attacks. So at like level 6, you're getting 2 attacks anyway. And it doesn't matter whether your first attack hits or not, you get the second attack. Now granted, it's at a lower attack bonus, but you still get the second attack no matter what. With cleave, you can't take the second attack if the first attack doesn't hit. And it has to be somebody within reach, which, you know, you have to do for the second attack for a full base attack bonus anyway. But because it's a standard action, there's all kinds of things it doesn't stack with. You can't do it at the end of a charge, for instance, though you couldn't get multiple attacks at the end of a charge anyway. But cleave just doesn't, early on it's really good. So if you're playing a campaign like levels 1 through 7 or something like that, like it's going to be a relatively low level campaign for the most part, cleave is actually not that bad. But if you're going to be in higher levels, if you're intending to go to levels 10 and above, don't bother with cleave. Once you start getting like 3 or 4 additional attacks, it's just not worth it to forego those attacks in favor of cleave. Yep. Also, cleave doesn't work with things like trip. I do not believe so. So, yeah. I wouldn't do cleave at higher levels. Also, it says right here, the feat Great Cleave, which is an improvement to cleave. Now, you already kind of heard my opinion on cleave to begin with. Great Cleave, I think, is pretty utterly useless, because, so cleave, you get to attack 2 people. Great Cleave, there's no limit to the number of people you can attack with Great Cleave. They just all have to be within your reach. Very, very, very rarely are you going to be in a position where there's going to be you're going to be just surrounded by enemies, and you're just going to be able to cleave through all of them. That's just not going to happen that often. So Great Cleave, I would really not bother with. Cleave itself could be worth it at lower levels. At the higher levels, it kind of tends to lose its luster. All right, so that's my opinion on Cleave. Another really good feat that you can take is All right, I was just looking at Rapid Reload here, which says, you can use crossbows. I would not recommend using a crossbow. I don't know if I made that clear earlier, but use a longbow if you can as a fighter. There's no real reason not to use a longbow. So crossbows just aren't very good because they have to reload, which really, most of the really, really good things to take are for ranged attackers are going to be stuff that makes them attack lots, and crossbows are just going to slow you down. You can make up with it with crossbow mastery, which will make it a free action, and you get to take all your attacks. But why waste the feat when you can just, and it requires a lot of feats to get there, so you're not going to get it until later level. So why make yourself suck at the beginning and spend all these feats just to get to the same point you would be with a longbow? Alright, but another feat that might be worth taking for you is Combat Reflexes. Combat Reflexes is a pretty good one, but it depends what your dexterity bonus is. Combat Reflexes allows you to take additional attacks of opportunity. If you are a big, scary fighter, and you're going to be in people's faces, and they're going to be provoking lots of attacks of opportunity from you, Combat Reflexes is the way to go. It's going to give you at least an additional attack of opportunity. If your dexterity is high, it's going to give you more. So Combat Reflexes might be something worth considering because, tactically speaking, it can be very powerful. The thing also about Combat Reflexes is it does give you access to things like Combat Patrol, which is an interesting one, where you can basically increase your threatened area, and you basically patrol an area and sort of control an area, which can be useful. I've never seen it actually be that useful, but that might be just because of the kind of games I play, and they tend to be in open ground. Alright, and aside from that, there are other good general feats to take, like Dodge. Dodge is not a bad one because it just increases your... In Pathfinder, Dodge is not a bad one to take because it just increases your Dodge AC by 1. It just gives you a flat +1 bonus to your Dodge AC, which is, that's great. No reason why that's not good. In 3.5, don't bother with Dodge unless you need it as a prerequisite. In 3.5, you have to declare your Dodge against an enemy every round, or else you don't have the bonus. And you only get it against the enemy you declared it against, which is 1, a pain in the butt to keep track of, and 2, is not very effective once you have more than one opponent that's attacking you. And in Pathfinder, it's just so much better. +1 dodge bonus to AC, yeah, that's good. I'll take that. And Dodge also opens up a couple of other goodies. There's a couple of things like Spring Attack, which might be worth getting, where you get to move if you tend to be very mobile. Aside from that, most of the other feats aren't going to be fantastic. I will mention Improved Critical. What Improved Critical does is it allows you... Wait, why is... Yeah, okay, Improved Critical. I don't know why that's here under Improved Counterspell. It should be its own kind of thing. But Improved Critical... it doubles the threat range of a weapon, which, like I said, is the entire reason why to take a falchion or a scimitar is to double its threat range. Improved Critical does that for you, and that's cool and all, except there's a problem with it. Improved Critical does not stack with Keen, so don't even try it. See, this does not stack with any other effects that expand range of a weapon. So it doesn't stack with Keen. And this costs you a feat, while Keen, on the other hand, is a relatively inexpensive weapon enchantment. So I usually say don't bother with Improved Critical because you're going to get a Keen weapon anyway. But that depends on the campaign, and it depends on sort of how much money you have access to and all that. So it depends on the campaign world. If you have access to lots of money, sort of an average amount of money in Pathfinder, and you can get a keen enchantment. You can get a keen enchantment usually by level 5, but level 5 you should probably have a keen enchantment. Because you need a +1 on a weapon, and then you got to get so it's a +2 weapon effectively. But you can get a keen weapon by level 5, and this thing you can't even get until level 8. So the improved critical just comes later, and it costs you a feat. And I tend to be that feats are more valuable than money. Again, that depends a little bit on the campaign setting. If you can't afford a keen weapon, and you're not going to be able to pretty much ever, then get improved critical, absolutely. But if you can just get a keen weapon, I would recommend that over improved critical and save your feats to get some other cool stuff. And there's always improved initiative. That is something you should always consider no matter who you are, because going earlier in combat is always a good thing. Now, it's not as important for the fighter as it is, say, for the wizard. If the wizard can go first and just completely debilitate the enemies before they even get to go, that's fantastic. But for a fighter, going first is also kind of nice. If you can kill an opponent before they get to go, that's just gravy. So, all right, I think I've given you enough feats to at least think about. There are a couple of other feats that are sort of generally good to take. Like there's Great Fortitude, which I prefer lightning reflexes, and I forget which what the will one is, but this one gives you +2 fortitude, and there are counterparts for all of that. There's +2 will, +2 reflex. You don't need the fortitude, but you might consider getting lightning reflexes. I think it's called lightning reflexes. Let me double check that for you. Yeah, lightning reflexes is +2 bonus to reflex save, and that's pretty good. Because don't forget, as a fighter, your will and reflex saves are going to be kind of crap compared to other characters. So the +2 to reflex and the +2 to will is also not bad. So that's a couple of the Iron Will is the one. That's the one. Iron Will is +2 to will. So that's actually worth getting, just to boost your will save a little bit. You don't want the party fighter to be dominated. Oh gosh, is that bad? So if you can avoid that, it's a good thing. Aside from that, most of these other feats, there are a couple of other feats that might be worth looking at depending on what you're going for. But like endurance, for instance, is another feat that you might consider getting for the sole reason that, like, okay, so the +4 bonus checks to avoid non-lethal damage is pretty dang useless. But if you click on endurance, you notice that that's not all it gives you. It gives you a ton of stuff. The most important of which is you may sleep in light or medium armor without becoming fatigued. So if you're wearing medium armor, as a fighter you're probably wearing heavy armor, but if you're wearing medium armor you don't become fatigued and you can sort of be battle ready, and if that's an issue in your campaign, that's how to do it. Alright, so I think that about wraps it up for feats, and I know that was the largest section, and that's going to be, you know, where most of your fighter awesomeness is going to come in. That is where fighters are made. And that about wraps it up for this. I'm going to mention one more thing just for higher level play, because we are talking about armor and weapons and all that kind of stuff. If you go to special materials, I'm pretty sure, look for mithril. Mithril is a really, really good really good for armors. Now, the reason why I haven't mentioned it before is because for fighters, it is almost prohibitively expensive. If you're wearing heavy armor, it will cost you 9,000 gold additional to whatever the heavy armor costs to make it mithril, to get mithril armor. But the benefits of it are many-fold, not the least of which, so first of all, you get your dexterity bonus that your armor allows increases by 2. And so if your dexterity bonus is relatively high, if you're like a 2-weapon fighter or a ranged fighter, you can actually run around in mithril heavy armor. So that's pretty cool, but it's very expensive. And you can do it with all kinds of other weapons. So mithril might be one checking out. Adamantium and some of these other ones I don't think are as good. Some of them are decent, but do be aware that this is an option. Mithril is one that I quite often take when I'm wearing, like, if I'm running around in light or medium armor. In heavy armor, might be worth it. But, so keep that in mind. And I think that about covers it. I hope I gave you enough to think about to sort of, build an effective fighter. Essentially, so if you've been listening to me the entire time, just sort of to recap really quickly, if you're trying to build sort of an optimized awesome fighter, I would go with a two-handed weapon fighter wielding a keen falchion with a maximized strength, 12 dex, 12 or 14 constitution, whatever you can muster. Play a human, then and then get a couple of feats like weapon specialization and greater weapon specialization, which also requires, I believe, weapon focus. So get those 3 feats just to maximize damage. Get power attack for sure. Maybe get improved trip if your DM is very, very nice and allows you to trip people with a hand that you could have free by wielding a two-handed weapon. If he doesn't do that, I wouldn't bother with improved trip. And then just maximize damage through that. Maybe get cleave. It's a low-level campaign. But yeah, and then just get a bunch of feats sort of as needed. And then you should have an awesome fighter that is a great build that'll deal lots of damage. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and I hope you learned a little bit about fighters and what I think is good in a fighter. I'm by no means infallible, and I didn't go over absolutely everything you could do with a fighter. I know I kind of neglected the ranged fighter a little bit, and the two-weapon fighter, and a little bit the sword and board fighter I think I completely sort of ignored. There is a couple of good shield specializations. One thing that I should mention right now is, because I'm thinking about it, is that if you're a sword and board fighter, you can get shield bash to basically become a two-weapon fighter, but with a shield and a weapon instead of 2 weapons. So you can do that. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope it's been helpful, and I hope to see you next time for some more of my videos. Thanks for watching.